Some stories are buried, some truths are hidden, and some evidence was never meant to be found. Welcome to Ink and Evidence, where silence tells stories, and every clue brings us closer to the truth. From chilling crime cases to unsolved mysteries and secrets the world tried to forget, we uncover what lies beneath. If you dare to question, if you seek the truth, then you're exactly where you need to be. Like the video, drop your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe and follow Ink and Evidence. Tell us where you're watching this video from. Your feedback always inspires us. Stay tuned to solve the mystery, because the truth always leaves a trace.
Let's begin today's story. The Missing Sapphire Necklace. Chapter 1. A Question in the Quiet Drawing Room. Snow had been falling since dusk, softening the old country house until it seemed less built of stone than remembered out of a dream. By midnight, every window of Harrowmere Hall was rimmed in white. Every yew tree bowed beneath a patient burden, and the long drive had vanished beneath a smooth, unbroken sheet. Inside, the drawing room glowed with firelight. It was a room made for secrets to grow comfortable. Heavy curtains shut out the winter night. The lamps were shaded in amber silk. A clock ticked with the delicate authority of something certain in a house where nothing else was. Near the hearth, 6 people sat as if arranged by an unseen hand. No one spoke of the body upstairs. Sir Edmund Vale had been found an hour earlier in his study, seated at his desk, his head resting gently upon an open ledger. There had been no violence, no overturned chair, no broken glass. Only a small crystal vial near his hand, empty, and a faint scent of bitter almonds in the air. Inspector Bell had sent for Mr. Adrian March, who had been staying in the village inn, delayed by snow and known, quietly, for solving what others preferred to call unfortunate accidents. Now March stood by the mantelpiece, small, immaculate, and calm, his dark eyes reflecting the fire. He had asked everyone to gather in the drawing room, not the dining room, not the study, here. Because, he said at last, his voice soft enough that all leaned nearer, this is the room where the murder began. Lady Vale looked up sharply. Her black dress drank the light. Murder, Mr. March. The doctor will call it poison. The law will call it murder. I prefer, March said, to call it a question. Across from her, young Clara Vale pressed a handkerchief between her fingers. Her fiancé, Mr. Thomas Reed, stood behind her chair, pale and watchful. Near the window, Edmund's brother, Colonel Vale, held himself stiffly, one hand tucked inside his coat. Mrs. Ansell, the housekeeper, sat rigid near the tea table, and beside the bookcase, Miss Lydia Crane, Sir Edmund's secretary, kept her eyes lowered. The fire shifted. A log collapsed into sparks. March turned slowly. At 10:30, Sir Edmund drank a glass of brandy in his study. At 11, he was dead, yet the decanter was clean. The glass showed no residue. The poison was not in the drink. Inspector Bell frowned. Then where was it? March smiled faintly. That is the quiet question. He walked to the tea table where a silver tray still held cups from earlier in the evening. At 9, the family took tea here. Sir Edmund did not take sugar. He did not take milk. He did, however, take lemon. Lady Vale whispered, many people take lemon. Indeed, but only one slice remained on his saucer. Mrs. Ansell stirred. I cut the lemons myself, sir, same as always. Yes, said March, and yet Sir Edmund's fingers bore a trace of oil, lemon oil, mixed with something less innocent. Miss Crane lifted her face. You think the poison was on the lemon peel? I think, said March, someone placed it where only Sir Edmund would touch it. A silence settled over them, deep and plush as snow. Colonel Vale gave a dry laugh. Convenient, we all knew his habits. Exactly, March said, which is why habits are dangerous things. He moved nearer Clara, her lashes trembled. Miss Vale, your father changed his will this afternoon. She closed her eyes. Yes. To disinherit you if you married Mr. Reed. Thomas spoke at once. I would never harm him. No, said March mildly. You are a passionate man, Mr. Reed, but not a patient one. This murder required patience. Thomas flushed but fell silent. March turned to Lady Vale. Your husband also intended to sell the London house. Her mouth tightened. It was his house. And your refuge. She looked toward the fire. A refuge can become a prison. True, March said, but you did not poison him. Her eyes flickered. How can you know? Because you believed he would die soon enough without help. His heart troubled him. You were waiting. A murderer does not wait so well. The clock ticked. March faced the colonel. You argued with your brother after dinner. Colonel Vale's jaw hardened. Private family matter. Debts are rarely private for long. The colonel's hand curled. He refused me money, that is all. And your injured hand? A shooting strain. No, lemon juice stings a fresh cut. At tea, Mrs. Ansell heard someone curse softly near the tray, but you took no lemon. You took whiskey later and held the glass in your left hand. You had not touched the poisoned peel. The colonel looked away, defeated by truth but not accused by it. March now turned toward Mrs. Ansell. The housekeeper's face was as white as folded linen. You prepared the tray, he said. I served this family 30 years. And loved it enough to know every key, every bottle, every locked drawer. But devotion is not motive. Her shoulders lowered by a fraction. A tear slipped down her cheek. Only Miss Crane remained still beside the bookcase. Outside, the wind pressed snow against the glass with a faint, dry whisper. March did not look at her immediately. Instead, he picked up a small embroidered cushion from Sir Edmund's favorite chair. This was moved tonight. Lady Vale frowned. How could you tell? Because the chair has a depression in the velvet where Sir Edmund rested his elbow. The cushion was returned wrongly, tassel outward instead of inward. Someone stood here after tea, nervous, perhaps listening. Miss Crane's fingers closed over one another. March's voice grew gentler. Sir Edmund dictated a letter today, a letter ending your employment. She said nothing. He had discovered that you were searching his old correspondence. Not stealing money, not betraying business, searching for a name. Clara looked up. What name? Miss Crane's lips parted, but no sound came. March answered for her, her mother S. The fire crackled softly, like a secret breaking. 26 years ago, March continued, Sir Edmund wronged a young woman in London. She bore a child and died poor. Miss Crane came here not as secretary, but as witness. She wished him to acknowledge her. Lady Vale stared at Lydia with sudden horror. He refused, March said. This afternoon he dismissed her. Tonight during tea, she placed poison upon the lemon slice he always chose with his fingers. Later, when he felt unwell, she followed him to the study not to save him, but to hear whether fear might make him honest. Lydia Crane raised her eyes. They were calm now, terribly calm. He knew me, she whispered. At the end, he knew my face. And what did you ask him? March said. She looked at the dying fire. I asked whether he remembered my mother. No one moved. And did he? Lydia smiled faintly, a small, broken thing. He said no. The room seemed to grow colder. Inspector Bell stepped forward, but March lifted a hand, not to prevent justice, only to preserve the hush a moment longer. At last, he said, we arrive at the question in the quiet drawing room, not who touched the lemon, not who wished him dead. But what does a forgotten life become when silence is the only inheritance? Lydia began to weep without sound. Beyond the curtains, the snow continued its patient work, covering the drive, the garden, the roof, and all the footprints that morning would ask to see. Inside, the clock marked the hour with one silver note, and the drawing room returned to stillness, holding its answer in firelight. Chapter 2. The Stillness of Rosewood Manor. The snow began just after twilight, descending over Rosewood Manor with the patience of an old memory. It gathered on the black branches of the elms, softened the stone lions beside the steps, and muffled the gravel drive until even the arrival of Inspector Lorne's motorcar seemed less an intrusion than a dream crossing another dream. Rosewood Manor had stood for 300 years at the edge of the moor, watching generations vanish through its doors. On that December night, every window glowed warmly against the cold, yet the house itself appeared strangely withheld, as though it had drawn a breath and never released it. Inside, the air smelled of beeswax, extinguished candles, and roses long out of season. In the drawing room, a fire burned low beneath a carved mantel. 5 people waited beneath the amber lamps, each wrapped in the same careful silence. Lady Alina Rosewood sat nearest the hearth, pale and upright, her hands folded in her lap. Her nephew Julian leaned against the piano, restless despite his stillness. Miss Beatrice Vale, the late Lord's ward, stared at the carpet as if searching its pattern for mercy. Mr. Harrow, the solicitor, stood by the window with snowlight on his spectacles. And old Mrs. Finch, the housekeeper, held a tray she had forgotten to set down. Lord Rosewood lay upstairs in the conservatory. He had been found among the wintering orange trees, seated in his wicker chair, a wool blanket across his knees and an untouched cup of tea beside him. At first, Mrs. Finch had believed him asleep. The conservatory was always warm, always fragrant with damp earth and glasshouse flowers, but his hand had been cold. His face was peaceful, too peaceful. There had been no wound, no overturned table, no cry heard in the night. Only stillness. Inspector Lorne removed his gloves slowly, while beside him stood Monsieur Celestin Armand, a small, precise gentleman with silver hair and eyes that missed very little. He had been a guest at the manor, invited for dinner and trapped by weather. It was Lady Alina who had asked him to remain. "A death in a locked conservatory," said the inspector, lowering his voice. The door was bolted from within, the glass unbroken, the man old and frail. "Old, yes," said Armand softly. "Frail, perhaps, but death, Inspector, is sometimes invited, sometimes it is arranged with excellent manners." He crossed to the tea table near the fire. Upon it rested the silver service from the evening, 6 cups, a plate of sugared violets, a small porcelain bowl of honey. Lord Rosewood had been known for his habits. At 9 o'clock each night, he took tea in the drawing room. At 9:30, he retired to the conservatory, where he listened to the snow or the rain upon the glass roof before bed. Every person in the room knew this. Every person had lived beneath the discipline of his routines. Armand lifted the honey spoon. It shone cleanly in the firelight. "Who poured his tea?" Mrs. Finch started. "I did, sir, as always." "And the honey?" "He added it himself, 1 spoon, never more." Lady Alina's voice was thin. "My husband believed excess was vulgar, even in sweetness." A faint tremor passed through the room. It might have been grief, it might have been relief. Armand turned to the inspector, "And the doctor?" "Heart failure, most likely, but he admitted the circumstances were odd." "Doctors are trained to recognize the body," said Armand. "Detectives must listen to the room." He walked slowly, almost lazily, as though following music only he could hear. Near Lord Rosewood's favorite chair, he paused. The chair faced the fire, its cushion pressed with the shape of an absent man. Beside it, on the carpet, lay a single dark petal. "A rose petal," said Beatrice unexpectedly. Armand looked at her. She blushed. "The winter roses in the west corridor. Lady Alina keeps them." Lady Alina did not turn. "My husband disliked roses indoors." "Yet the manor is named Rosewood," murmured Armand. "He disliked many things that belonged to others before him." Julian gave a short, quiet laugh, then stopped when the inspector looked his way. Armand picked up the petal with a handkerchief. "Curious, the conservatory contained no roses." "There are roses everywhere in this house," said Julian. "It proves nothing." "No," Armand agreed. "A clue rarely proves, it whispers." The wind moved against the shutters. Somewhere deep in the house, a pipe knocked, then settled. Armand asked each of them where they had been between 9 and 10. Lady Alina had gone to her room with a headache. Julian had written letters in the library. Beatrice had played softly in the music room until the clock struck 10. Mr. Harrow had reviewed papers in Lord Rosewood's study. Mrs. Finch had been in the kitchen, preparing the warming pan. Their answers were neat, too neat perhaps, but grief often tidies itself when strangers enter the house. "And what papers occupied you, Mr. Harrow?" asked Armand. The solicitor adjusted his spectacles. "Lord Rosewood's new will." At this, Lady Alina closed her eyes. Julian straightened. Beatrice went very still. "A new will," said Armand, "signed tonight. To be signed tomorrow morning." "And its contents?" Mr. Harrow hesitated. "Confidential." The inspector cleared his throat. The solicitor sighed. Lord Rosewood intended to leave the estate not to Lady Alina nor to Mr. Julian, but to Miss Vale. Beatrice lifted her head in shock, so pure it seemed impossible to counterfeit. "I did not know," she whispered. Julian stared at her. You expect us to believe that? I knew nothing. Lady Eleanor spoke without looking at either of them. Arthur always preferred surprises to kindness. Armand watched them in the firelight. The widow with her controlled sorrow, the nephew with his wounded pride, the ward with bewildered eyes, the solicitor guarding paper like a priest guarding sin. Then he asked to see the conservatory. They climbed the staircase in a hush broken only by the soft tread of shoes and the faint hiss of snow against the windows. The conservatory lay at the end of the west corridor, beyond a pair of glass doors now opened by force. Warm air breathed out, carrying the green scent of leaves and wet soil. Lord Rosewood's chair stood beneath the tallest orange tree. The cup of tea remained on the small table. Armand bent over it, inhaled, and did not touch. Almond asked the inspector, "No, Rose." He looked upward. The glass roof was misted with heat on the inside, snow on the outside. One upper pane stood slightly ajar, no wider than a hand. "The room was locked," said Lorne, "but that window could not admit a person," said Armand. "Only air or something carried by air." He examined the blanket, the chair, the floor. At last he stopped beside a brass heating vent set low in the wall. Caught in its grill was a fragment of pale thread, almost invisible. Back in the drawing room, Armand stood before them with the quiet gravity of a man about to disturb the dead. "Lord Rosewood was not poisoned in his tea," he said. "He was suffocated gently, without struggle, by a vapor released into the conservatory through the heating vent. A preparation made from crushed winter roses and laudanum, warmed until it filled the room. Enough to lull an old man into sleep, enough to ensure he never woke." Mrs. Finch crossed herself. Armand held up the thread. The vial was wrapped in muslin and placed in the vent before dinner. Later, when the heat rose, the drug rose with it, but muslin catches where metal bites, and rose petals fall from careless sleeves. Lady Eleanor's face had become very calm. "My husband feared cold," she said. "He always demanded extra heat." "Yes," said Armand, "and you knew it." Julian whispered, "Aunt Eleanor." She looked toward the fire, not at him. Arthur was going to leave Rosewood to Beatrice because she reminded him of himself, young enough to obey the memory of him. "I did not kill him for money." "No," said Armand gently. "You killed him because he was going to send Mrs. Finch away. Then Julian. Then you. One by one, all the living would be removed so his will could rule an empty house." A tear moved down Lady Eleanor's cheek, bright in the lamplight. "He made stillness of us all," she said. "For years, I merely gave it back to him." No one spoke. Even the inspector waited before stepping forward. Outside, the snow continued to fall over Rosewood Manor, covering the drive, the gardens, the roof of the warm conservatory where the orange leaves shivered in hidden currents. Inside, the fire lowered itself to embers, and the house, freed of one silence and burdened with another, stood listening to the night. Chapter 3. Guests beneath polite smiles. By 9 o'clock, the snow had sealed the valley, and Ashcombe House stood in its white silence like a lantern forgotten in a dream. Its windows glowed against the winter dark, each pane softened by frost, each curtain drawn against the wind that moved through the pines with a low, patient sigh. Inside, the dinner guests smiled. They smiled over crystal glasses, over silver spoons, over candlelight trembling in polished mahogany. They smiled at compliments they did not believe and at jokes that had wounded more delicately than insults. Around Lord Ashcombe's table, politeness had become a kind of theater, and each guest knew his part too well. At the head sat Lord Ashcombe, broad-shouldered, silver-haired, and coldly amused. Beside him, his second wife Helena wore pearls at her throat and sorrow at the corners of her mouth. Across from her sat Mr. Felix Vane, a charming cousin with debts hidden beneath velvet manners. Miss Clara West, Lord Ashcombe's niece, watched the candles burn lower. Mr. Stephen Hale, the family physician, spoke rarely. And at the far end, Monsieur Emile Caron, invited by chance and detained by weather, listened as though every silence had grammar. Dessert was pears poached in wine. Lord Ashcombe lifted his spoon, smiled at no one in particular, and said, "One discovers at my age that loyalty is often just poverty wearing gloves." The room became very still. Felix laughed lightly. Helena looked down. Clara's hand tightened around her napkin. Dr. Hale coughed once into his fist. Karen, small and neat in his dark suit, regarded the lord with mild curiosity. He had heard men make enemies. He had rarely seen one do it with such calm enjoyment. After dinner, they withdrew to the drawing room, where a fire breathed warmly beneath the marble mantel. Coffee was poured. The snow tapped softly at the windows. A gramophone played a waltz so quietly it seemed to come from another house. Then Lord Ashcombe raised his cup, frowned, and touched his chest. No one moved at first. His face had not changed much. Only his fingers had stiffened around the porcelain. The cup slipped, struck the carpet, and left a dark stain like spreading ink. He looked toward the guests with an expression almost surprised, as if politeness itself had failed him. By the time Dr. Hale reached him, Lord Ashcombe was dead. Inspector Marlowe arrived near midnight, boots wet with snow, his coat powdered white. He found the guests gathered again in the drawing room, no longer smiling, though something of the habit remained on their faces. "Poison," Dr. Hale said softly. "I cannot yet say what kind." "The coffee?" asked Marlowe. Karen stood near the mantel, warming his hands. "Perhaps, perhaps not. A cup may accuse too easily." Inspector Marlowe, who knew Karen by reputation, inclined his head. "Then what accuses less easily?" "The manner of the evening," Karen replied. "A murder among polite people must be studied politely." He crossed to the low table where the coffee service remained. 6 cups, a silver pot, sugar tongs resting beside a bowl of white cubes, a small dish of candied orange peel, everything orderly, everything innocent. "Who served the coffee?" Helena answered, "I did." Her voice was composed, but her pearls trembled faintly against her throat. "And Lord Ashcombe took sugar?" "Never," said Clara. "He said sugar was for children and diplomats." "He took orange peel," Felix added. "Always he liked the bitterness." Karen lifted his eyes. Always is a dangerous word in a household. The inspector examined the cups. If the poison was not in the coffee, then in the orange peel. "Possibly," Karen turned to the dish. "Yet all might have taken it." "I did," said Felix. "As did I," said Helena. Clara shook her head. Dr. Hale said nothing. Karen noticed. "Doctor, I dislike candied fruit." "Convenient," murmured Felix. Dr. Hale's gaze hardened. "A medical man need not poison by dessert." "No," said Karen. "He has better opportunities." The fire crackled, and the remark settled softly among them. Karen began with Helena. Lord Ashcombe had humiliated her often, and that evening had mentioned changing her allowance. She listened without protest. "My husband enjoyed fear," she said, "but fear can become familiar. Familiar things lose their power." Felix Vane owed money in London. Lord Ashcombe had refused him help after dinner. Felix admitted it with a shrug too elegant to be honest. "I wished him generous," he said, "not dead." Clara West had expected to inherit until a new will had been hinted at. Her cheeks flushed when Karen mentioned it. "My uncle promised nothing without first making one ashamed for wanting it." Dr. Hale had attended Lord Ashcombe for years. He had access to medicines, poisons, and private grievances. At this, the doctor looked into the fire. "He destroyed my brother," he said at last. "Long ago, a failed investment, a ruined name, a grave before 30. The room seemed to exhale. Inspector Marlowe stepped nearer. "You concealed that." "I concealed it because grief is not evidence." "No," said Karen softly, "but concealment is a curtain. One must ask what stands behind it." He moved slowly through the room, not searching so much as remembering. Near the sofa where Lord Ashcombe had fallen, he paused and bent to the carpet. Among the dark coffee stain glittered a few grains, pale and crystalline. "Sugar?" asked Marlowe. "Not sugar," said Karen. "Salt." Helena frowned. There was no salt in the drawing room. "Indeed." Karen turned toward the dining room doors. Lord Ashcombe ate pears and wine, sweet, rich, then coffee bitter, then orange peel bitter again, yet his final taste, I think, was salt. They followed him back to the dining room. The candles had burned low in their silver sticks. The abandoned table looked strangely intimate, as if the empty chairs still remembered the bodies that had occupied them. Karen stood behind Lord Ashcombe's chair. Beside the plate lay a folded napkin. He lifted it carefully. A faint white line marked the inner edge. "Here," he said. Dr. Hale leaned in. Salt again. Yes, but mixed with powdered aconite. Not in the food, not in the coffee, on the napkin. Marlowe stared. The napkin. Lord Ashcombe had a small habit. After the candied orange peel, he touched his fingers to his lips, then wiped them, always with the inside fold. A precise man. A vain man. The poison entered through the mouth, carried by his own fingers. Karen looked around the table. Only someone who observed him closely over years would rely upon such a habit. The silence turned its face toward Helena. She did not deny it. She stood beneath the chandelier, pale and almost peaceful. He corrected me once, she said, for folding his napkin wrongly. He made the servants watch while he showed me the proper way. Felix whispered, Helena. She continued gently, as though recalling a lesson from childhood. Tonight I folded it correctly, exactly as he liked. Inspector Marlowe lowered his eyes. Karen spoke with sadness rather than triumph. You knew suspicion would fall on the coffee, then the fruit, then the doctor, but the napkin would seem beneath notice. Too domestic, too obedient. Helena's smile appeared at last, small and exhausted. Obedience was all he ever trusted. Beyond the windows, the snow kept falling, covering the drive and the footprints, softening the world until every harsh edge disappeared. Inside Ashcombe House, the candles leaned toward their own extinction. The guests stood beneath the remains of their polite smiles, and in the warm drawing room where the gramophone had wound down to silence, the truth rested among them as delicately as folded linen. He bent over the hearth. The fire had burned low, but not evenly. One log, blackened on one side, had rolled forward from the grate. Near it, caught beneath the brass fender, was a curl of blue paper half singed. Duval lifted it with tweezers, a telegram form. The inspector leaned close. Can you read it? Only 2 words, arriving tonight. They returned to the library, where the guests had not moved, though something in the room had changed. Suspicion had settled among them like another person, quiet and attentive. Lord Blackthorne received a telegram, said Duval. Who was arriving tonight? Mr. Pike adjusted his collar. No one could arrive in this snow. Yet someone announced the intention. Lady Blackthorne's voice was calm. My husband had many business acquaintances. And enemies? Asked the inspector. Her gaze did not waver. A man who enjoys control rarely lacks them. Captain Verney gave a soft laugh, then stopped when Duval looked at him. Duval questioned them gently, almost lazily. Lady Blackthorne had been in the drawing room at midnight playing patience by the fire. Miss Evelyn had retired early, then returned when the alarm was raised. Mr. Pike had been reviewing estate papers in the morning room. Captain Verney had stepped outside to smoke beneath the portico, though no one had seen him there. An unpleasant night for tobacco, Duval observed. I needed air. In a snowstorm. Captain Verney smiled. Some rooms become close. Miss Evelyn suddenly said, My brother was frightened tonight. All eyes turned to her. He tried not to show it, but at dinner when the telegram came, his hand shook. Lady Blackthorne said sharply, You imagined it. No, Evelyn whispered. I watched him fold it. He put it in his waistcoat pocket. Duval nodded, and yet the pocket was empty when the room was opened. Inspector Vale stared. You found his coat. On the chair, said Duval, with no man inside it. A silence followed, colder than the corridor. The detective returned alone to the study. For several minutes the others heard only the faint movements of his search. The opening of drawers, the scrape of the fender, the soft creak of floorboards. Then he called for them. They found him beside the long case clock in the winter garden, just outside the study wall. The clock had not struck with the others. Its hands stood at 12, but its pendulum was still. This clock, said Duval, shares a chimney wall with the study fireplace. A service hatch behind it allows the flue to be cleaned. Inspector Vale opened the narrow panel. Behind it was darkness, soot, and a cramped passage descending toward the cellar. Lady Blackthorne rose slowly. Impossible. Not for a living man prepared to crouch, said Duval, nor for a dead man carried by one who knew the house. Mr. Pike closed his eyes. Duval turned to him. You knew Lord Blackthorne's father built that hatch after the chimney fire of '89. You handled the old plans. Tonight you lured Lord Blackthorne with the telegram. You met him in the study before midnight. You killed him quietly, perhaps with the paper knife now missing from his desk. Then you carried him through the hatch while the clocks began to strike. Pike's face had become gray. The watch, Doyle continued, was stopped deliberately at midnight to make the disappearance seem supernatural. But soot was on your cuffs, Mr. Pike, not much. Enough. Lady Blackthorne whispered, "Why?" Pike looked at her then, and something like sorrow passed through him. Because he discovered the accounts. I had borrowed from the estate for years. I meant to repay it. Men always mean to repay what has already ruined them. Inspector Vale stepped forward. "And the body?" he asked. Doyle glanced toward the cellar stair. "Behind the coal bins, I fear, wrapped in the old hearth rug from the study." No one moved for a moment. The house seemed to listen. Then far down in the walls, a draft stirred, and the silent long-case clock gave one dull, delayed note, though no hand had touched it. Outside, the snow continued falling over Blackthorn Hall, covering the drive, the gates, the frozen garden, and the roof beneath which a man had tried to vanish another man from time itself. In the library, the fire settled into embers. The guests sat beneath their lowered eyes, and midnight, though long past, seemed to remain in the room, waiting to be understood. Chapter 4. The Disappearance at Midnight. At midnight, the clocks of Blackthorn Hall began to strike. There were 7 clocks in the house, one in the entrance hall, one in the library, one above the dining room mantel, 2 in the east corridor, one small gilt clock in Lady Blackthorn's sitting room, and one ancient long-case clock beside the winter garden. They did not strike together. They answered one another slowly, silver note after silver note, until the house seemed to be counting its own secrets in the dark. Outside, snow pressed against the windows with a soft, persistent hush. The moor beyond had vanished. The carriage road had vanished. Even the iron gates at the end of the drive were no more than 2 black strokes in a white world. Inside, the guests waited for Lord Blackthorn to return from his study. He had excused himself at 11:45, saying he wished to fetch a letter before the brandy was served. At 5 minutes past 12, his sister remarked that he was taking rather long. At 10 past, his wife sent a footman to knock. At 12:15, the study door was found locked from the inside. By 12:20, the door had been forced open. Lord Blackthorn was gone. The room was warm, orderly, and empty. A fire burned quietly in the grate. His chair stood pushed back from the desk. A half-written note lay beneath his fountain pen. The windows were latched. Snow lay unbroken outside the glass. There was no second door, no hidden passage that anyone could find, and no footprint upon the polished floor except those made by the men who entered. Upon the desk beside the letter stood Lord Blackthorn's pocket watch. It had stopped at midnight. The household gathered in the library, where the firelight made islands of gold upon the rugs. Lady Blackthorn sat beneath a green-shaded lamp, her face composed into something colder than grief. Miss Evelyn Blackthorn, the Lord's younger sister, held a handkerchief she did not use. Mr. Adrian Pike, solicitor and lifelong friend, stood near the bookshelves with his hands behind his back. Captain Miles Verney, Lady Blackthorn's cousin, watched the door as though expecting the vanished man to return from it laughing. And in the leather chair nearest the hearth sat Monsieur Alaric Doyle, a small, elegant detective delayed at the house by snow, his dark eyes resting on each face in turn. Inspector Vale arrived from the village in a coat glittering with frost. "A disappearance from a locked room," he said, not quite hiding his irritation. "At midnight, very theatrical." "Life is often theatrical," said Doyle softly. "Death even more so, but disappearance requires an audience." Lady Blackthorn looked up. "You think my husband is dead?" "I think," Doyle replied, "that if Lord Blackthorn wished merely to leave, he would not have left his watch." No one spoke. The watch had been more than a habit. Lord Blackthorn had carried it since his father's death. He wound it each evening at 10, polished it with a silk cloth, and consulted it as if time itself were an employee of the estate. Doyle requested that no one touch the study until he had examined it. The corridor was narrow and dim, lined with portraits whose painted eyes followed the candlelight. At the study door, splintered wood showed where the lock had given way. Inside, the air smelled faintly of smoke, ink, and cold metal. Doyle moved with delicate care. The desk faced the fire. The window faced the north lawn where fresh snow lay smooth beneath the moon. The hearth rug had been drawn slightly askew. A decanter of brandy stood unopened. On the blotter, the unfinished note read, "At last I understand why." Nothing more. Inspector Vale frowned. "Why what?" "That," said Doyle, "is precisely the sort of sentence a murderer enjoys leaving unfinished." He bent over the hearth. The fire had burned low, but not evenly. One log, blackened on one side, had rolled forward from the grate. Near it, caught beneath the brass fender, was a curl of blue paper half singed. Doyle lifted it with tweezers. A telegram form. The inspector leaned close. "Can you read it?" "Only 2 words, arriving tonight." They returned to the library, where the guests had not moved, though something in the room had changed. Suspicion had settled among them like another person, quiet and attentive. "Lord Blackthorne received a telegram," said Doyle. "Who was arriving tonight?" Mr. Pike adjusted his collar. No one could arrive in this snow. Yet someone announced the intention. Lady Blackthorne's voice was calm. "My husband had many business acquaintances." "And enemies?" asked the inspector. Her gaze did not waver. A man who enjoys control rarely lacks them. Captain Verney gave a soft laugh, then stopped when Doyle looked at him. Doyle questioned them gently, almost lazily. Lady Blackthorne had been in the drawing room at midnight playing patience by the fire. Miss Evelyn had retired early, then returned when the alarm was raised. Mr. Pike had been reviewing estate papers in the morning room. Captain Verney had stepped outside to smoke beneath the portico, though no one had seen him there. "An unpleasant night for tobacco," Doyle observed. "I needed air." "In a snowstorm." Captain Verney smiled. "Some rooms become close." Miss Evelyn suddenly said, "My brother was frightened tonight." All eyes turned to her. He tried not to show it, but at dinner when the telegram came, his hand shook. Lady Blackthorne said sharply, "You imagined it." "No," Evelyn whispered. "I watched him fold it. He put it in his waistcoat pocket." Doyle nodded, and yet the pocket was empty when the room was opened. Inspector Vale stared. "You found his coat?" "On the chair," said Doyle, "with no man inside it." A silence followed, colder than the corridor. The detective returned alone to the study. For several minutes the others heard only the faint movements of his search. The opening of drawers, the scrape of the fender, the soft creak of floorboards. Then he called for them. They found him beside the long case clock in the winter garden, just outside the study wall. The clock had not struck with the others. Its hands stood at 12, but its pendulum was still. "This clock," said Doyle, "shares a chimney wall with the study fireplace. A service hatch behind it allows the flue to be cleaned." Inspector Vale opened the narrow panel. Behind it was darkness, soot, and a cramped passage descending toward the cellar. Lady Blackthorne rose slowly. "Impossible." "Not for a living man prepared to crouch," said Doyle, "nor for a dead man carried by one who knew the house." Mr. Pike closed his eyes. Doyle turned to him. "You knew Lord Blackthorne's father built that hatch after the chimney fire of '89. You handled the old plans. Tonight you lured Lord Blackthorne with the telegram. You met him in the study before midnight. You killed him quietly, perhaps with a paper knife now missing from his desk. Then you carried him through the hatch while the clocks began to strike." Pike's face had become gray. "The watch," Doyle continued, "was stopped deliberately at midnight to make the disappearance seem supernatural. But soot was on your cuffs, Mr. Pike, not much. Enough." Lady Blackthorne whispered, "Why?" Pike looked at her then, and something like sorrow passed through him. "Because he discovered the accounts. I had borrowed from the estate for years. I meant to repay it. Men always mean to repay what has already ruined them." Inspector Vale stepped forward. "And the body?" he asked. Doyle glanced toward the cellar stair. "Behind the coal bins, I fear, wrapped in the old hearth rug from the study." No one moved for a moment. The house seemed to listen. Then far down in the walls, a draft stirred, and the silent long case clock gave one dull, delayed note, though no hand had touched it. Outside, the snow continued falling over Blackthorne Hall, covering the drive, the gates, the frozen garden, and the roof beneath which a man had tried to vanish another man from time itself. In the library, the fire settled into embers. The guests sat beneath their lowered eyes, and midnight, though long past, seemed to remain in the room, waiting to be understood. Chapter 5. Whispers, glances, and unspoken motives. Snow had fallen all evening upon Evermere House, smoothing the lawns, whitening the hedges, and pressing a soft, deliberate quiet against every pane of glass. By 10:30, the old manor seemed afloat in winter darkness, its chimneys breathing faintly into the night, its windows glowing like watchful eyes behind curtains of frost. Inside, the drawing room was warm enough for roses to open in their vases. A fire burned beneath the marble mantel, low and golden. Lamps with amber shades cast gentle pools of light across the Persian carpet. The air carried the scent of polished wood, black tea, and the faint lavender perfume that Mrs. Althea Wren always wore when she wished to appear calm. She did not appear calm now. She sat upright near the hearth, her fingers resting lightly on the arms of her chair, her gaze fixed upon the doorway through which Sir Malcolm Wren had been carried 20 minutes earlier. Not dead when they found him. Not quite. He had lain at the foot of the east staircase, one hand curled around the banister, his lips moving as though still trying to finish a sentence. By the time Dr. Cresswell arrived from the guest room, Sir Malcolm had said only 3 words. "Not the glass." Then he died. Now the household and guests waited beneath the delicate tyranny of those words. There was Mrs. Wren, the widow, pale as candle wax and twice as still. There was her stepson, Oliver, handsome and restless, standing by the bookshelves with his shoulders too straight. Miss Viola Wren, Sir Malcolm's daughter, sat in shadow beside the piano, her eyes red but dry. Mr. Edgar Finch, the family solicitor, warmed his hands before the fire and looked at no one. Dr. Cresswell remained near the tea table, thoughtful, grave, and silent. And at the center of the room, with his small gloved hands folded over the silver head of his cane, stood Monsieur Lucien Valker. He had been invited to dinner as a curiosity by Sir Malcolm himself, who admired famous detectives in the abstract and distrusted them in person. Valker was neat, soft-spoken, and almost drowsy in manner, but his eyes moved gently from face to face as if reading letters written in invisible ink. Inspector Grant, brought through the snow by a stable boy on horseback, stood beside him with melting flakes still on his coat. "The doctor suspects poison," said the inspector. "Sir Malcolm collapsed after taking brandy in the billiard room, hence his last words, I assume. Not the glass." Valker tilted his head. "A dying man may deny a thing, Inspector, or he may direct us away from a mistake. The glass was clean. So we are told." Dr. Cresswell stepped forward. "I examined it myself. No odor, no residue. I have sent for proper testing, but I do not believe the brandy was poisoned." Valker smiled faintly. "Then Sir Malcolm was considerate enough to assist us before dying." Mrs. Wren closed her eyes. The detective crossed to the tea table. Upon it stood the remains of the evening's comfort: a silver pot, cups in thin porcelain, a plate of shortbread, and a cut glass bowl of sugared plums. Beside the bowl lay a single white glove, folded once at the wrist. "Whose glove?" asked Valker. Viola looked up. "Mine. I removed it after dinner. The fire made the room warm." "A room may be warm," he murmured, "and still contain cold thoughts." Oliver gave a short laugh. "Must we endure poetry while my father lies dead?" "Not poetry, monsieur. Precision wearing velvet." The inspector questioned them in turn. Sir Malcolm had dined with all present at 8. At 9, they gathered here for tea. At 9:30, Sir Malcolm and Oliver argued softly in the billiard room. At 10, Sir Malcolm retired toward his study, taking a small brandy. Minutes later, a cry, or perhaps only the fall, brought them into the hall. "What was the argument?" asked Grant. Oliver's face tightened. "Family business." Valker regarded him pleasantly. "Family business is often a locked box containing money." After a pause, Oliver said, "He intended to cut my allowance." "Because of gambling." "Because he enjoyed punishment." Viola whispered, "Oliver." He turned on her. "Do not pretend he was gentle because he is dead." Her expression closed like a door. Valker moved toward her. "And you, mademoiselle, did Sir Malcolm punish you?" She drew a slow breath. "He refused my marriage." "To Captain Ellis?" "Yes." "Because the captain was poor." "Because father preferred obedience to happiness." Mrs. Wren spoke then, her voice soft but edged. "Malcolm believed he knew what was best for everyone." "And you, madame?" Valker asked. She looked at him. "He knew nothing of me." The words fell lightly, but every face in the room turned toward her. Mr. Finch cleared his throat. Sir Malcolm had recently altered his will. "Ah," said Valker. "At last the ghost enters carrying documents." The solicitor looked troubled. He left the estate in trust. Mrs. Wren would receive the house for life, Oliver a reduced income, and Miss Viola nothing if she married without approval. Viola's cheeks flushed. Oliver stared into the fire. Mrs. Wren remained motionless. "And you, Mr. Finch?" asked Valker. "I gained nothing by his death." "No one gains nothing," said Valker gently. "Some gain money, some freedom, some silence." The fire shifted. A coal broke apart with a sigh. Valker asked to see the staircase. They moved into the hall where the air was cooler and the shadows taller. The east staircase rose in polished oak, curving toward the dark upper landing. On the third step, a faint smear marked the wood. Near the banister, Valker found 3 small grains of something pale and powdery. "Sugar?" asked the inspector. Valker touched one carefully to a handkerchief, then smelled it. "No, chalk perhaps, or face powder." Mrs. Wren stiffened almost imperceptibly. From the landing came a soft draft. The detective looked upward and noticed a narrow table against the wall, holding a vase of white lilies and a shallow bronze dish. In the dish lay calling cards, a wax seal, and a tiny silver pencil. Valker picked up the pencil. Its point was damp. "Curious," he said. "Who wrote here tonight?" No one answered. He returned to the drawing room and stood in the firelight, holding the pencil as though it weighed more than silver. Sir Malcolm was not poisoned in the brandy, nor in the tea. The poison was placed on something he touched after drinking, something he carried to his lips by habit. "The sugared plums?" asked Grant. No, he did not take one, but he did have another habit. When passing the bronze dish on the landing, he would pick up the little pencil and make notes on calling cards, appointments, corrections, instructions. He was a man who could not pass even silence without editing it. Mr. Finch whispered, "The pencil." Yes, its tip was treated with a solution of aconite. Sir Malcolm moistened it with his tongue, as he had done 1,000 times. Oliver went pale. Viola put a hand to her mouth. Valker turned not to them, but to Mrs. Wren. "Your face powder contains rice starch, madame, not chalk. Yet on the stair we found powder from a pharmacist's wrapping. You prepared the poison in your room, spilled a little on your cuff, and brushed it away at the staircase." Sir Malcolm fell before reaching the study. Her eyes were wide but strangely peaceful. "He was sending me away," she said. "Quietly, legally, politely. After 11 years of being displayed like furniture and corrected like a servant." Valker's voice softened, and the unspoken motive. She looked toward the closed door. "There was a child before Malcolm, my child. He discovered it, called it disgrace, and threatened to find her to ruin her name if I resisted." The room changed with that confession. Suspicion became sorrow. "I did not want his money," she whispered. "I wanted him to leave one innocent life untouched." Inspector Grant stepped toward her slowly, almost respectfully. Outside, the snow continued falling, covering hoofprints, carriage tracks, and the dark road beyond the gates. Inside Evermere House, the fire burned low, and the guests sat beneath their whispers, glances, and unspoken motives, each understanding at last that silence was never empty. It merely waited for someone patient enough to hear it. Chapter 6. The Sapphire's Silent Trail. Snow lay thick upon the roof of Bellwether House, turning every gable white and every chimney into a dark finger raised against the moon. Beyond the windows, the garden had disappeared beneath winter's soft correction. Only the fountain remained visible, frozen in the courtyard, its stone angels veiled in frost. Inside, the blue sapphire was gone. It had vanished from a locked glass case in the music room shortly after dinner, while 6 guests sat before the fire and listened to Miss Aurelia Bellwether play Chopin with trembling hands. The sapphire had rested there for 50 years, a deep, cold stone set in a silver brooch, famous not only for its value, but for the old scandal attached to it. They called it the Morning Star. At 11 o'clock, Lady Bellwether rose to show it to her guests. At 11 past, she found the case empty. No hinge broken, no glass cracked, no key missing. Only a faint blue thread lay on the velvet cushion where the jewel had been. By midnight, Inspector Hale had arrived through the snow, and with him came Monsieur Etienne Moreau, a small, composed gentleman whose reputation for solving delicate crimes had made him welcome in houses where truth was feared more than scandal. The suspects waited in the drawing room. Lady Bellwether sat beneath a green-shaded lamp, her face arranged into aristocratic grief. Her son, Adrian, stood near the drinks table, pale with irritation. Miss Orlia Bellwether, his cousin, kept her hands folded tightly in her lap, as if still hearing the music she had played. Mr. Lionel March, an art dealer, studied the fire with professional melancholy. Mrs. Clara Devlin, Lady Bellwether's companion, looked toward the door at every sound. And Mr. Thomas Vale, the family solicitor, held his spectacles in one hand and polished them, though they were already clear. "The house is sealed," Inspector Hale said. "The snow outside the music room windows is untouched. The door was in view of the guests. The key never left Lady Bellwether's chain." Morrow smiled gently. Then the Sapphire did not leave by door or window. How considerate of it. Adrian sighed. "Must we endure riddles?" "Only until the truth becomes less rude," said Morrow. He asked to see the music room. It was a graceful chamber, narrow and warm, with ivory walls and heavy curtains of blue velvet. A fire burned low. The grand piano stood open, its strings still faintly fragrant with polish and dust. Against the wall rested the glass display case, elegant and empty beneath the lamplight. Morrow bent close. The lock was untouched. The velvet cushion bore a small indentation where the brooch had lain. At its edge, the blue thread caught the light like a sliver of evening sky. "From the curtain?" asked Hale. Morrow touched the curtain nearest the case. "No, this velvet is darker and thicker. Our thread is silk, from a glove perhaps, or embroidery." He turned to the piano. On the polished lid, barely visible, lay a dusting of white powder. "Face powder," said the inspector. "Perhaps, or rosin. Musicians leave traces where thieves forget to breathe." Back in the drawing room, the fire had settled into a deep amber glow. Morrow spoke quietly. "The Sapphire was stolen during the music. That much is clear. Music is useful. It fills rooms, lowers suspicion, and teaches people where not to look." Orlia looked up. "I never left the piano." "No," said Morrow, "but everyone watched you there." Lady Bellwether's mouth tightened. "My guests are not thieves." "My lady," Morrow said, "every thief is first a guest somewhere." He began with Adrian. The son needed money. His racing debts had already passed from rumor into arithmetic. He admitted as much with a cold shrug. "I intended to ask my mother to sell the brooch," he said. "She refused. She preferred dead ancestors to living creditors." Lady Bellwether did not deny it. Lionel March had arranged, quietly, to appraise the Sapphire that morning. He knew its value, knew collectors abroad, and wore gloves of pale gray silk. But when Morrow asked him to show them, the gloves were clean and unfrayed. "I covet beauty," March said, "but I do not pocket it." Thomas Vale, the solicitor, knew the case mechanism and the insurance papers. He also knew, as he reluctantly confessed, that the Sapphire was to be transferred to a bank vault the following week. "Then tonight was the last convenient night," Morrow observed. Mrs. Devlin, the companion, had once worked as a lady's maid and knew how to mend silk, open stubborn clasps, and move unseen through rooms where she was not meant to matter. She sat very still while this was said. "And Miss Orlia?" asked Inspector Hale. Orlia's voice was low. "I played, I heard nothing, saw nothing." "Ah," said Morrow, "the artist's perfect alibi." Her cheeks colored. The detective returned to the music room alone and requested that Miss Orlia play the same piece again. The household gathered at the doorway as the first notes rose, soft and sorrowful, into the lamplight. Morrow stood not by the case, but beside the piano. At a certain passage, Orlia leaned forward. Her left hand crossed gently over her right. Her sleeve brushed the polished wood. Morrow's eyes lowered to the hem of her cuff, where tiny blue flowers were embroidered in silk. One flower was missing a thread. When the music ended, the room held its breath. Morrow lifted the piano lid higher. Beneath its edge, caught near the hinge, something glimmered. Not the sapphire, but a narrow silver pin from the brooch's fastening. "The jewel was removed before Lady Bellwether opened the case," he said. "That is impossible," said Adrian. "We saw it there." "You saw a blue gleam on velvet, but not the sapphire. A substitute was placed there, a shard of blue glass from the Venetian paperweight on the piano. Under glass in lamplight during music, the eye accepts what it expects." Lady Bellwether rose. Who would dare? Morrow turned to Mrs. Devlin. Someone who knew the real Sapphire was never kept in the case at night. The companion closed her eyes. A murmur passed through the room. "Lady Bellwether," Morrow continued, "you had already removed it before dinner and placed it in your private jewel box. You feared theft because you knew your son's debts, but when you announced the display, you forgot the empty case. Mrs. Devlin saw your panic. She placed the blue glass there to spare you embarrassment, then later removed it, creating a theft where there had been only concealment." Inspector Hale frowned. "But where is the sapphire?" Morrow looked gently at Mrs. Devlin. "That is the second theft." Her hands trembled. "I meant to return it. After selling the paste copy you commissioned." She looked startled. The white powder on the piano was jeweler's plaster. The silver pin broke when you compared the settings. You were not stealing for greed alone. Mrs. Devlin's composure broke. "My sister is dying. Lady Bellwether would not advance my wages. She said illness among poor relations was endless." Lady Bellwether whispered, "Clara." "The sapphire belonged to my grandmother," Mrs. Devlin said, suddenly fierce beneath her softness. "Your husband wanted at cards and called it inheritance." The room fell silent. Morrow crossed to the sewing basket beside her chair. From beneath folded linen, he drew a small packet wrapped in blue silk. Inside, the morning star shone cold and deep, holding the firelight as if it had swallowed night itself. No one reached for it. Outside, snow continued to fall over Bellwether House, covering the courtyard, the frozen fountain, and every path by which a secret might escape. Inside, beneath the warm lamps and lowered eyes, the sapphire lay restored upon the table. Yet its silent trail had revealed what jewels so often conceal. That value is not always beauty, and theft does not always begin with the hand. Sometimes it begins years earlier, in a room where someone powerful smiles and takes what can never truly belong to them. Chapter 7. An elegant but deceptive conclusion. By the time the snow ceased falling, Hawthorne Hall had become a white island beneath a moonless sky. The fields beyond the terrace lay silent and silvered, the trees bent under their soft burden, and the old house glowed from within, as though firelight alone kept it from surrendering to winter. In the drawing room, the final guests waited. It had been an evening designed to end graciously. Dinner had been perfect. The pheasant tender, the wine generous, the conversation polished until even old resentment seemed to shine. Lady Hawthorne had smiled beneath her diamonds. Her stepson, Philip, had laughed more often than was natural. Miss Celia Ward, the late Lord's niece, had spoken softly of music. Reverend Bell had praised the warmth of the room. Mr. Ambrose Flint, the solicitor, had unfolded no papers, though everyone knew he carried them. And Sir Julian Hawthorne, master of the house, had raised his glass after dessert and announced that before morning, one person present would be disappointed. At 10 minutes past 11, he was found dead in the blue salon. Not violently, not dramatically. He lay upon the chaise long beneath the portrait of his first wife, one hand resting upon his waistcoat, his expression almost amused. Beside him stood a tray with a single cup of black coffee. The door had been closed, the windows latched, the fire burned quietly, nothing seemed disturbed except the future. Now Inspector Reeve stood by the drawing room mantel, broad and damp from his ride through the snow, while beside him Monsieur Pascal Renard watched the company with grave, delicate attention. Renard had been invited for the weekend because Sir Julian enjoyed clever men, provided they never became inconvenient. Tonight, he had become very inconvenient indeed. "The doctor suspects poison," said Inspector Reeve. Lady Hawthorne gave the smallest shiver. "In the coffee." "Perhaps," said Renard before the inspector could answer. "But poison in coffee is a conclusion too elegant, therefore we must distrust it." Philip Hawthorne looked up sharply. "Are you saying he was not poisoned?" "I am saying the murderer wished us to begin there." The coffee cup was brought in upon its tray. Renard did not touch it. He merely leaned close, inhaled, and smiled faintly. "Bitter almonds?" asked Reeve. "Burnt chicory," said Renard. "And fear, perhaps, but fear leaves no scent." He turned to the room. "Sir Julian dined with you, drank with you, insulted at least one of you, and withdrew alone. Who carried the coffee?" The butler Marsh stepped forward from the shadows near the door. "I did, sir. Her ladyship ordered it." Lady Hawthorne lifted her chin. "Julian always took coffee before retiring." "With sugar?" asked Renard. "Never. With cream. He despised cream." Then the coffee gave no handhold to the poisoner, said Renard softly. How disappointing. Mr. Flint cleared his throat. Surely the cup may yet. Accuse someone convenient, Renard finished. Yes, that is why it must wait. He asked to see the blue salon. The room was colder than the drawing room, though its fire still lived. Pale blue silk covered the walls. Snowlight pressed against the windows. The portrait above the chaise showed the First Lady Hawthorne, young, dark-eyed, and serene in a gown the color of storm clouds. Renard stood before it for a long moment. Sir Julian chose an audience for his death, he murmured. Inspector Reeve frowned. A portrait. Sometimes the dead are less silent than the living. On the table near the chaise lay a book of French verse, a paper knife, and a small silver box of lozenges. Renard opened the box. Only one lozenge remained, dusted white with sugar. He suffered from his throat, asked Reeve. Only when he had been speaking too much, said Marsh. A common illness among powerful men. Renard examined the hearth. In the ash lay a charred curl of thick paper, too heavy for ordinary correspondence. He lifted it carefully. One word remained visible along the edge, settlement. Back in the drawing room, warmth had not softened the faces. It had only made their stillness more apparent. Renard began with Lady Hawthorne. Sir Julian had planned to alter her marriage settlement. She would lose the London house, the carriage allowance, perhaps even the jewels she wore with such calm desperation. He could not take what was mine, she said. He could, said Mr. Flint quietly. Her eyes flashed toward him. Philip had quarreled with his father that afternoon about debts. Celia Ward had been told she must leave Hawthorne Hall in the spring. Reverend Bell had sought a donation for the village orphanage and been refused with humiliating wit. Mr. Flint possessed the legal knowledge to understand every gain and loss. Each had motive, each had composure, each had lied, though not necessarily about murder. Renard listened to them all as the fire settled lower, and the clock placed delicate seconds between their answers. Then Celia spoke unexpectedly. He was frightened of the portrait tonight. Lady Hawthorne turned. Nonsense. No, Celia said. At dinner he kept looking toward the salon door. He said, she will have the last word yet. I thought he meant my aunt. Renard's eyes narrowed with interest. The First Lady Hawthorne died how? In Italy, said Philip. Fever. Mr. Flint looked down. Not fever, said Renard gently. Scandal. The solicitor's hand tightened around his spectacles. Renard faced him. The burned paper in the salon was part of an old settlement. Sir Julian had decided to destroy evidence of what he did to his first wife's fortune. But you knew. You drew up the original papers. Flint's voice was dry. I was young. And obedient. And poor. Renard nodded. A dangerous combination. Inspector Reeve stepped closer. Did he blackmail you? No, said Flint. He merely reminded me that my reputation lived because he allowed it. Yet you did not kill him, said Renard. A breath moved through the room. The detective turned to the silver box of lozenges, now resting on the table between them. Sir Julian was poisoned by habit, not by coffee. Each night after coffee, he took a lozenge before bed. The poison was placed upon the top suite. Aconite brushed in syrup, dried to a harmless gloss. He carried death to his own mouth. Philip whispered, who filled the box? Marsh, the butler, bowed his head. I placed it in the salon, sir, as always. But you did not poison it, said Renard. You are too exact. The box was set slightly crooked on the tray. A servant would have corrected it. A gentleman would not notice. A lady would arrange it beautifully. His gaze moved at last to Celia. She did not flinch. In the firelight, her youth seemed to recede, leaving something older behind her eyes. My aunt did not die of fever, she said. No, said Renard, and tonight Sir Julian learned you had found the letters. Celia's voice remained low and clear. He sent her away ruined, ill, and alone. He kept her money, her name, even her portrait. He let us dine beneath her face as if she were decoration. Lady Hawthorne covered her mouth. Philip stared at the floor. I came here for proof, Celia continued. Not for murder, but after dinner he laughed. He said no one would care what happened 20 years ago to a woman already dead. Renard's expression was sorrowful. So you chose an elegant conclusion. She looked at the lozenge box. No, I chose the only word he would understand. Inspector Reeve moved toward her slowly. Outside, the snow began again, so lightly it seemed the sky was breathing. It covered the old tracks on the drive and gathered on the blue salon windows, where the portrait of the First Lady Hawthorne watched from within. In the drawing room, no one spoke. The fire lowered itself to embers, and the conclusion they had admired for its elegance lay exposed at last. Not elegant at all, but shaped from grief, sharpened by memory, and made deceptive only because truth had waited so long to be heard. Chapter 8. Beneath the surface of truth. Snow had been falling since dusk upon Alderwick House, softening its steep roof, its black chimneys, and the long terrace that overlooked the frozen lake. By 11, the world beyond the windows had disappeared into whiteness, and the old manor seemed to float alone in the dark, held in place only by lamplight and the slow breathing of its fires. Inside, the family gathered in the morning room, though it was nearly midnight. The room was small, warm, and lined with books no one had opened for years. A coal fire glowed beneath the mantel, casting a gentle red pulse over the faces assembled there. Lady Marian Alderwick sat very straight upon the settee, one hand resting over the other. Her son Edward paced near the windows, stopping each time the wind pressed snow against the glass. Miss Iris Vale, Lady Marian's niece, sat near the writing desk, pale and watchful. Mr. Samuel Pike, the estate agent, kept his gaze low. And Dr. Rowan, old friend of the family, stood beside the hearth with a cup of tea growing cold in his hand. They were waiting for the lake to give up its answer. Sir Henry Alderwick had gone out at 10:30, saying he wished to inspect the boathouse before the storm worsened. At 11, his lantern was seen burning on the ice. At 15:15, the lantern vanished. When the stable boys reached the lake, they found a dark break in the frozen surface, a walking stick lying nearby, and footprints leading from the terrace to the water. No footprints returned. Inspector Greaves arrived shortly before midnight, red-faced from the cold, his boots leaving wet marks on the tiled hall. With him came Monsieur Raoul Delmont, a quiet, elegant detective who had been staying in the village after a delayed train and whom Dr. Rowan had urgently summoned. "An accident," said Edward at once, as if saying it quickly might make it true. "The ice was thin near the reeds. Father knew that, but he was stubborn." Delmont removed his gloves finger by finger. Stubbornness may lead a man onto thin ice. It does not always explain why he goes there at midnight. Lady Marian looked toward the fire. Henry did many things at inconvenient hours. "So do murderers," murmured Inspector Greaves. The word settled softly upon the room, colder than the weather outside. Delmont asked to see the terrace. They stepped into the night through the glass doors. The cold entered the lungs like silver. Snowflakes drifted through the lantern light, slow and weightless. Below the terrace, the lake stretched pale and still, its surface broken near the far boathouse by a jagged black wound. Delmont walked carefully beside the footprints. They were deep, deliberate, made by Sir Henry's heavy boots. Beside them, just once, he noticed a narrow mark in the snow, as if something had been dragged and lifted. "At what time was the lantern seen?" he asked. 11, said Pike. "I saw it from the estate office window." "And you were working late." "The accounts required attention." "Accounts often do," said Delmont, "especially when someone has been hiding inside them." Pike did not answer. Near the broken ice, the inspector crouched. "The stick is his, no doubt, the prints end here." Delmont gazed down into the black water. Beneath the surface, something pale shifted slowly, then vanished. "The lake is deep?" he asked. "Deep enough," said Dr. Rowan, "and cold enough to stop the heart." "Water preserves many things," Delmont said, "but not always truth." Back inside, the morning room felt almost too warm. The fire hissed. Someone had poured fresh tea. No one drank it. Delmont began gently, with questions that seemed harmless until they were not. Sir Henry had been a hard man. He had planned to dismiss Pike after discovering irregularities in the estate rents. He had threatened to disinherit Edward if he married without approval. He had refused to provide money for Iris, though her late mother had left funds in his care. He had argued with Lady Marian that very afternoon. "About what?" asked Inspector Greaves. Lady Marian's expression did not change. "About the past. We had little else left between us." Edward stopped pacing. "Mother." She lifted one hand, silencing him. Delmont watched her closely. The past is rarely passed in houses such as this. It waits in drawers, in portraits, in locked rooms. At that, Iris looked toward the writing desk. The detective noticed. He crossed to it and opened the top drawer. Inside lay sealing wax, envelopes, a blotter, and a small brass key. Lady Marian said, "That is Henry's." "To what?" "The boathouse cupboard, I believe." Delmont lifted the key. It was damp. No one spoke. He asked for the boathouse to be opened. The walk across the snowy terrace and down to the lake path was slow, lanterns bobbing in the darkness. At the boathouse door, the lock gave with a reluctant click. Inside smelled of rope, wet wood, and old varnish. A boat hung from iron hooks. Oars rested neatly against the wall. In the corner stood a cupboard. Delmont unlocked it. Within were ledgers wrapped in oilcloth, a woman's faded shawl, and a pair of boots. Not Sir Henry's boots, smaller, narrower. Their soles were packed with snow. Iris gave a little cry. Delmont turned to her with compassion. "You came here tonight." She lowered her head. "Yes." "Why?" "To find the ledgers, my mother's money. Sir Henry said there was no proof, but I knew there was." Edward stared at Pike. "You helped her." Pike's face crumpled slightly. "Her mother trusted me once. I should have spoken years ago." Inspector Greaves stepped forward. "Did you push Sir Henry?" "No," Iris whispered. "He never came to the lake." The room seemed to tilt. Delmont's eyes grew still. "Say that again." "I waited in the boathouse from 10 until past. He did not come. I heard the hall clock strike 11 from across the ice. Then I saw the lantern move near the reeds, but it was not him. It was too low, swinging strangely. I was frightened and ran back by the old path." Inspector Greaves frowned. "But the footprints?" "Were made earlier," said Delmont softly. "Before the snow thickened, someone walked to the lake wearing Sir Henry's boots, carrying his stick, and placed the lantern upon the ice, then broke the surface to suggest a fall." Edward whispered, "Then where is my father?" Delmont looked at Dr. Rowan's untouched tea. "Not beneath the lake." The doctor's hand tightened around the cup. Delmont spoke with great gentleness. "Sir Henry did not drown. He died in this house before 10 o'clock. A draught given for his heart was made stronger than intended, or perhaps exactly as intended." Dr. Rowan closed his eyes. Lady Marian turned slowly toward him. "Charles." The doctor's voice was tired. He was going to expose Iris as illegitimate, not only take her money, destroy her name. "Your sister begged me years ago to protect the child if I could. I failed her once." "And the lake?" asked Greaves. "I carried him to the old ice house," Rowan said. "Then made the false trail. I thought the water would be blamed. I thought winter would keep its silence." Delmont shook his head. "Winter keeps nothing. It merely covers things until we are ready to see their shape." They found Sir Henry in the ice house before dawn, wrapped in a carriage blanket, his face calm beneath a dusting of frost. No struggle marked him, no terror, only the faint astonishment of a man who had believed himself untouchable. By morning, the snow had stopped. Pale light spread over Alderwick House, over the terrace, over the lake whose broken surface reflected the sky like dark glass. In the morning room, the fire had sunk to ash, and those who remained sat quietly, each changed by what had risen from beneath the surface of truth. For the lake had not taken Sir Henry. It had only shown them where to look. Chapter 9. Poirot's Final Gathering. The snow had begun before dusk, falling with a quiet persistence that softened the roofs, buried the garden paths, and turned Kingsmere House into a warm, glowing island in a sea of white. By midnight, the world beyond the windows had vanished completely. There was only firelight, polished wood, and the slow hush of winter pressing its face against the glass. In the great drawing room, the guests sat in a careful semicircle. No one had chosen those places. They had been invited to them. Monsieur Poirot stood before the hearth, small, immaculate, and grave. The flames gilded the edges of his silver hair and cast a delicate shadow beneath his famous mustache. He seemed older tonight, not weaker, but quieter, as though the long years of listening to lies had taught him the value of silence. On the low table beside him rested a sealed envelope, a silver letter opener, and a single pearl button. Sir Lionel Kingsmere had died 2 nights before in that very room, not with violence, not with alarm. He had simply leaned back in his chair after dinner, closed his eyes, and never opened them again. The doctor had spoken of the heart. The family had spoken of sorrow. The servants had spoken of nothing at all. But Poirot had looked at the room, and the room had answered. Lady Kingsmere sat nearest the lamp, dressed in black silk, her face calm and pale. Her stepson Arthur stood behind her chair, restless and elegant. Miss Rosamond Vale, Sir Lionel's niece, watched the fire with red-rimmed eyes. Mr. Percival Hume, the solicitor, kept his gloved hands folded over his cane. Captain Julian Frost, a guest delayed by snow, stared at the carpet as if it might open beneath him. Inspector Marden, broad and damp from his journey through the storm, waited near the door. Poirot lifted the pearl button between finger and thumb. "It is a little thing," he said softly. "But murder, mes amis, is often betrayed by little things. A thread, a gesture, a cup turned slightly from its saucer, a button that should not be where it is." Lady Kingsmere's voice was cool. "You sent for us at midnight to discuss a button." "No, madame, I sent for you to discuss truth. The button merely arrived first." The fire cracked gently. Somewhere in the house, a clock began to strike the hour, each note traveling slowly through the corridors like a cautious footstep. Poirot turned to the inspector. "Sir Lionel took brandy that night." "Yes," said Marden. "1 glass, nothing found in it." "And coffee?" "Shared by all." "And his medicine?" Dr. Bellamy, summoned from the village and silent until now, inclined his head. "Digitalis for the heart, correct dosage in the bottle." Poirot nodded. "So we have a dead man, no poison in the glass, no poison in the coffee, no poison in the medicine. It is elegant, is it not?" Arthur Kingsmere gave a brittle smile. "Then perhaps he died naturally." "Ah," said Poirot, "that is always the most comforting lie." He moved slowly across the room, his polished shoes making almost no sound upon the rug. "Sir Lionel was a man of habits. At 10 o'clock he drank brandy. At 10:15 he took his medicine. At 10:30 he sat here and turned the pages of the evening newspaper, though he read only the financial column." "Everyone knew that?" said Rosamond quietly. "Yes, everyone knew." Poirot looked at her kindly. "And so everyone could have used it." He began with Arthur. Sir Lionel had threatened to disinherit him after discovering gambling debts. Arthur admitted the debts, denied the murder, and looked wounded by both. "You wanted money," said Poirot. "I wanted freedom," Arthur replied. "Freedom is more expensive." Then Lady Kingsmere. Sir Lionel had planned to remove her from the London house and settle her in the country, away from society, away from influence, away from everything she still loved. "My husband arranged lives as one arranges furniture," she said. "But furniture does not always remain where it is placed." Poirot bowed slightly. "A sentiment, madame, but not yet a confession." Mr. Hume, the solicitor, knew the contents of the will. Captain Frost owed Sir Lionel a sum hidden beneath a failed investment. Rosamond had been promised an allowance that Sir Lionel intended to withdraw. Each motive lay before them, like cards placed gently upon a table. Yet Poirot did not touch the envelope. Not yet. Instead, he lifted the newspaper from the stand beside Sir Lionel's empty chair. "This paper is important." Inspector Marden frowned. "It was searched." "For poison?" "Yes." Poirot smiled sadly. "Always the poison, never the person." He opened the paper to the financial column. A faint brown stain marked the edge of the page, no larger than a raindrop. Near it, almost invisible, a torn place showed where something small had been fastened. "A pin," Poirot said. "A very fine pin, dipped in a preparation strong enough to enter the blood through the finger." Sir Lionel turned the page, pricked himself, felt only a sting, and continued. Later, his heart, already weak, obeyed the murderer. Dr. Bellamy whispered, "Aconite." "Something near enough." Arthur stepped back. "That is monstrous." "Most murders are," said Poirot. "Only the rooms are beautiful." He turned to the pearl button. But the murderer made one mistake. The pin was attached with thread from a cuff. While removing it, the cuff caught upon Sir Lionel's chair. The button fell beneath the cushion. Lady Kingsmere looked toward Arthur. Arthur looked toward Captain Frost. Captain Frost looked at no one. Poirot's voice remained gentle. "The button belonged to a woman's evening glove. Pearl, not mother of pearl, French work. Expensive, mended once with blue silk." Rosamond slowly raised her hand to her mouth. Poirot faced her with sorrow. "Mademoiselle." The room became very still. "No," Arthur whispered. Rosamond did not cry. She sat upright, small and pale in the firelight. "He killed my father," she said. Lady Kingsmere closed her eyes. "Not with his hands," Rosamond continued. "With paper, signatures, ruin dressed as business. My mother begged him for mercy. He laughed. Then he took me in, educated me, displayed me, and called it charity." Poirot lifted the sealed envelope at last. "Sir Lionel wrote this before he died. He had begun to suspect you, not of murder, but of searching his private files. He intended to send you away." Rosamond looked at the envelope. "Did he say he was sorry?" Poirot's gaze lowered. "No," he said softly. "He said the past was not admissible." A faint smile touched her lips, and it was more heartbreaking than tears. "Then he died as he lived, correctly." Inspector Marden stepped forward, but slowly, as though the snow outside had entered his bones. Poirot placed the button beside the envelope. "Justice is not revenge, mademoiselle. Revenge wears the clothes of justice because it wishes to be invited indoors." Rosamond bowed her head. Outside, the storm began to fade. The snow no longer struck the windows, but drifted past them in pale, wandering flakes. In the drawing room, the fire settled lower, its gold light dimming over the faces of those who had come to hear the truth and found pieces of themselves inside it. Poirot stood very still, one hand resting on the mantel. For a moment, he seemed not like a detective at the end of a case, but a man at the end of a long road, listening to the silence after the last footstep. Then he turned from the fire. "The gathering is over," he said. And in Kingsmere House, beneath the soft white weight of morning snow, no one mistook silence for innocence again. Chapter 10. The Necklace and the Human Heart. Snow fell over Whitcomb Manor with the hush of a secret being carefully kept. It covered the long lawns, softened the black hedges, and gathered along the windowsills in smooth white ledges. Beyond the glass, the winter night had no shape. Within, every room glowed with firelight, polished brass, and the quiet exhaustion that follows an elegant dinner. In the music room, the necklace had vanished. It was not an ordinary necklace. Lady Whitcomb called it the Heart of Avignon, though others called it, more simply, the Red Necklace. 30 rubies, deep as wine, surrounded a single diamond that rested against the throat like a frozen tear. It had been worn by brides, widows, actresses, and one queen whose portrait still watched the upper landing with sorrowful eyes. At 10 o'clock, Lady Whitcomb had unclasped it before the mirror, complaining of its weight. At 10:15, she opened the velvet case to show it to her guests. The case was empty. No window had been opened. No servant had entered. The music room door had remained in plain view of the drawing room, where everyone sat drinking coffee while the snow whispered against the panes. By 11, Inspector Mallory had arrived from the village, and with him came Monsieur Gabriel Ardent, a small, immaculate gentleman whose eyes were dark and patient, and whose manners made accusation sound almost like sympathy. The household gathered in the drawing room. Lady Whitcomb sat upright beneath the amber lamp, one hand resting upon her bare throat, where the missing necklace seemed still to weigh upon her. Her husband, Sir Geoffrey, stood by the mantel, severe and pale. Their daughter, Evelyn, watched the fire with a face too calm for innocence or guilt. Mr. Roland Pierce, an art dealer and family friend, leaned against the bookcase. Mrs. Ada Venn, Lady Whitcomb's companion, sat near the tea table with her gloved hands folded tightly. And young Daniel Crest, the estate secretary, held himself in the shadows, as though attention itself might wound him. Inspector Mallory cleared his throat. No sign of forced entry, no footprints beneath the window, no servant passed the corridor. Someone in this room took it. Lady Whitcomb let out a delicate breath. How vulgar. Ardent smiled faintly. Theft is often vulgar, madame, motive almost never is. He requested to see the music room. It was a narrow, beautiful chamber, paneled in pale wood, with a grand piano beside the hearth and shelves of old scores bound in green leather. A mirror stood above a dressing table, its surface reflecting the empty velvet case. Beside it lay a powder puff, a crystal perfume bottle, and one pearl-headed pin. Ardent bent over the case without touching it. The necklace was placed here. For only a moment, said Lady Whitcomb from the doorway. I removed it because it scratched my neck. Jewels, Ardent murmured, are small tyrants. They ask to be admired, then punish the skin that carries them. He examined the clasp. There, caught in the hinge of the velvet lid, was a fragment of pale thread. "White silk," said Inspector Mallory. "Not white," said Ardent. "Ivory, from a lady's glove perhaps, or a handkerchief, or a secret kept too close to the heart." Back in the drawing room, the fire had sunk lower. Shadows climbed the bookshelves. The guests seemed changed now, not by new facts, but by the awareness that facts were approaching them. Ardent began with Sir Geoffrey. "You insured the necklace last month." Sir Geoffrey's jaw tightened. Many families insure heirlooms. Only after money has begun to leave the house faster than dignity can explain. A silence followed. Sir Geoffrey looked away. Lady Whitcomb spoke coolly. "My husband's difficulties are tedious but not criminal. Yet the necklace would solve them." "It would solve many things," said Evelyn quietly. Ardent turned to her. "For you also, mademoiselle." Her eyes lifted. "My mother intended to give it to me upon my marriage." "And you are to marry Captain Harlan." "I was, until father withdrew his consent." "Because Captain Harlan is poor." "Because he is honest," she said, and then wished she had not. Roland Pierce smiled gently. "A rare defect." Ardent faced him. "You valued the necklace this afternoon." "I admired it." "You offered to purchase it privately." "I made a professional suggestion." "A generous one." "A discreet one." "Discretion," said Ardent, "is the perfume worn by many improper arrangements." Mrs. Venn looked down at her hands. Daniel Crest shifted near the curtains. Ardent noticed. "And you, Mr. Crest, as secretary, you knew the insurance details, the family accounts, the habits of the room." Daniel swallowed. "I know many things I wish I did not." Lady Whitcomb looked sharply at him. "Daniel." He fell silent. The detective moved toward Mrs. Venn. "You were once a jeweler's assistant, were you not?" Her face remained composed, but her hands tightened. "Before my marriage. You would know how to open a clasp, remove stones, recognize paste from true." "I would also know," she said softly, "that rubies are less rare than kindness." The sentence entered the room and remained there. Inspector Mallory frowned. "Where were you when Lady Whitcomb removed the necklace?" "In the drawing room, pouring coffee." "Did anyone leave?" "No one for more than a minute," said Mrs. Venn, "except Mr. Crest, who fetched the shawl Lady Whitcomb had forgotten in the hall." Daniel looked stricken. "I returned at once." "With the wrong shawl," Evelyn said suddenly. All eyes turned to her. She continued, barely above a whisper. "Mother asked for the blue shawl. Daniel brought the ivory one." Ardent closed his eyes briefly, as if hearing a distant note resolve. "The ivory shawl," he said. "Where is it now?" Lady Whitcomb gestured to a chair near the fire. The shawl lay folded there, soft and innocent, its fringe shining faintly in the light. Ardent lifted it. From one edge hung a single broken thread. "Ah," he said, "the heart leaves a trail." He carried the shawl to the music room and laid it beside the velvet case. The thread matched perfectly. Inspector Mallory turned to Daniel. "You took the necklace when you fetched the shawl." "No," said Ardent. The room stilled. "Mr. Crest disturbed the case, yes, but he did not steal the necklace. He found it already empty. Then, being frightened, he closed the lid too quickly and caught the shawl thread." Daniel covered his face. "I thought Lady Whitcomb had hidden it. I thought there would be scandal." "There was already scandal," Ardent said gently, "only not the one you feared." He turned to Lady Whitcomb. "Madame, you removed the necklace before entering the music room. The weight troubled you because the necklace you wore tonight was not the true heart of Avignon. It was a copy." Sir Geoffrey stared at her. "Margaret." Her hand rose again to her throat. Ardent continued. "The real necklace was sold weeks ago to Mr. Pierce, who arranged the private transaction. The insurance policy was then increased. Tonight's disappearance was meant to create a theft, a claim, and silence." Roland Pierce said nothing. Inspector Mallory stepped forward. "Then Lady Whitcomb is the thief." "No," said Ardent softly. "She is a liar. The thief came afterward." Mrs. Venn had grown very pale. Ardent looked at her with sadness. You recognized the copy the moment you poured coffee. You understood what had been done. When Daniel fetched the shawl, you slipped into the music room by the inner servant's door, took the paste necklace from Lady Whitcomb's reticule and hid it. Lady Whitcomb whispered, "Ada." Mrs. Venn's eyes filled, but her voice remained calm. She sold the real necklace to pay debts created by pride. Then she meant to blame a servant, or Daniel, or anyone soft enough to break. "And where is the copy?" asked Mallory. Mrs. Venn reached into the sewing basket beside her chair and withdrew a small linen pouch. The necklace spilled into her palm, brilliant and false, red glass trembling in the firelight like captured blood. "I was going to give it to Evelyn," she said. "Not for money, so she would know what her inheritance truly was." Lady Whitcomb looked smaller then, diminished not by crime but exposure. Outside, the snow continued its gentle work, covering the drive, the garden, and every hurried mark left by the living. Inside, the necklace lay upon the table between them, beautiful and worthless, while the human hearts around it revealed their greater value and their greater danger. The fire whispered low in the grate, and no one in Whitcomb Manor mistook brilliance for truth again. Ardent continued. "The real necklace was sold weeks ago to Mr. Pierce, who arranged the private transaction. The insurance policy was then increased. Tonight's disappearance was meant to create a theft, a claim, and silence." Roland Pierce said nothing. Inspector Mallory stepped forward. "Then Lady Whitcomb is the thief." "No," said Ardent softly. "She is a liar. The thief came afterward." Mrs. Venn had grown very pale. Ardent looked at her with sadness. "You recognized the copy the moment you poured coffee. You understood what had been done. When Daniel fetched the shawl, you slipped into the music room by the inner servant's door, took the paste necklace from Lady Whitcomb's reticule and hid it." Lady Whitcomb whispered, "Ada." Mrs. Venn's eyes filled, but her voice remained calm. "She sold the real necklace to pay debts created by pride. Then she meant to blame a servant, or Daniel, or anyone soft enough to break." "And where is the copy?" asked Mallory. Mrs. Venn reached into the sewing basket beside her chair and withdrew a small linen pouch. The necklace spilled into her palm, brilliant and false, red glass trembling in the firelight like captured blood. "I was going to give it to Evelyn," she said. "Not for money, so she would know what her inheritance truly was." Lady Whitcomb looked smaller then, diminished not by crime but exposure. Outside, the snow continued its gentle work, covering the drive, the garden, and every hurried mark left by the living. Inside, the necklace lay upon the table between them, beautiful and worthless, while the human hearts around it revealed their greater value and their greater danger. The fire whispered low in the grate, and no one in Whitcomb Manor mistook brilliance for truth again.